Good morning, Highlands Presbyterian Church. It is August 9th. Our gospel reading for today is from the 5th chapter of Mark, verses 1 through 20, as we continue on in our study of the miracles in Mark's gospel. So hear now the word of the Lord. They came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes. And when Jesus had stepped out of the boat, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit. He lived among the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain. For he had often been bound with shackles and chains, but he wrenched the chains apart and he broke the shackles in pieces. No one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains he was always crying out and cutting himself with stones. And when he saw Jesus from afar, he ran and fell down before him, and crying out with a loud voice, he said, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." For he was saying to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." And Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" He replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." And he begged him earnestly not to send them out of the country. Now a great herd of pigs was feeding there on the hillside, and they begged him, saying, "Send us to the pigs, let us enter them." So Jesus gave them permission. And the unclean spirits came out and entered the pigs, and the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea and drowned in the sea. The herdsmen fled and told it in the city and in the country, and people came to see what it was that had happened, and they came to see Jesus and saw the demon-possessed man, the one who had had the legion, sitting there, clothed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. And those who had seen it described to them what had happened to the demon-possessed man and to the pigs, and they began to beg Jesus to depart from their region. As Jesus was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed with demons begged Jesus that he might be with him. And Jesus did not permit him, but said to him, "Go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you, and how he has had mercy on you." And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone marveled. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Now I'll start out by saying that I'm a bit of a conditional cat person. You know, when a cat curls up on your lap, it can be a wonderful, calming thing, but otherwise, cats, I have found, can be somewhat challenging to live with. We had two when we were in Tennessee and found someone who gave them a better home as we were moving out, for we found that our cats and our children did not mix. The children were chasing the cats, and the cats lived in constant fear, and so we found them a much more peaceful place. But cats, their personalities do not always endear themselves to people. And so I was thinking about that in light of a story I heard about a cat named Unsinkable Sam that was originally on the Bismarck, which was a German battleship that was sunk in World War II and was found clinging to a piece of debris by a British ship that rescued it. And then that British ship later went on to be sunk, and lo and behold, Unsinkable Sam was rescued from that shipwreck and was eventually on a third ship, and lo and behold, that ship also was sunk. And when Sam was rescued from that, he was wet and apparently very angry, clinging to a piece of debris, and at that point he was retired from being on a ship. I know I certainly would not get on a boat that had a cat that had been on 3 previous shipwrecks, and lived out his life in peace at a home for sailors after that. But I think of that image of this cat wet and angry, having survived now his third shipwreck, and apparently was not the most inviting creature when they were trying to rescue it the third time. And I think as we sit here and we reread the story of Jesus and the demoniac, in 21st century America, we're encouraged, we're always taught to think of ourselves highly and to have this positive self-image, and that's important to a degree. But when we think about our lives of faith, we are the ones in need of rescuing. We are in a desperate situation, kind of wet and clinging to a debris in the midst of a storm, and it is Christ, and it is only Christ who ultimately can save us from death and destruction. And fortunately, Christ does come. But it's so important to realize our true state of condition. We are ultimately, eternally dependent on Christ to save us. We are in need of a Savior to come from outside of ourselves, to come and rescue us. Just like this demoniac needed someone, he was kind of banished to the tombs. The townspeople had pushed him out. They tried to tie him with chains. He kept breaking them, and he was alone and in desperate need of a Savior. And Jesus comes from outside of himself, outside of his world, to save him, to release him from the demons that tormented him. And I think there's something to say about demons. And again, in our culture, it is probably not very common to believe in demons. And yet, when I read the Gospels, when I read the New Testament, Jesus clearly believed in the power of demons. He acknowledged the power of demons over people. And so if Jesus took them seriously, if Paul took the power of evil seriously, I think we too need to take it seriously. And maybe it doesn't look exactly the same as it did in the Gospels. Maybe today it looks more like anxiety and depression and addiction in the way that we are attacked. And notice how in this story, the demons, the man was cutting himself with stones. The demons were trying to destroy what was made in the image of God. And I think in the same way today, the powers of evil are trying to destroy what was made in the image of God. They're trying to destroy you and I. And fortunately, Jesus comes to us. He comes to save, to release us. And so the demons in this man in Mark, when they see the authority and power of Jesus, they beg Jesus not to send them out of the country. And so Jesus allows them. They recognize his power and Jesus' sovereignty. And so Jesus allows them to enter this herd of pigs, which are then drowned in the sea. In the waters, they are lost. And I think it's so important for us to think about how we are claimed in the waters of baptism. We are marked as Christ's own forever. And through those waters, we are saved from the powers of evil that would threaten to destroy us, that would threaten to claim us. We are still living in this in-between times as we wait for Jesus to return and claim that final victory and vanquish the forces of sin and evil. But we know how the story ends, and so we can live as a people of hope. We can live as a people encouraged by what Christ has done for us, and know that those powers that threaten us, that try to claim us, will not be victorious because we have been claimed in the waters of baptism. And so, friends, remember your baptism and rejoice. And so at the end of the story, this man who's been released from his possession, he wants to follow Jesus, to get in the boat and go with Jesus. But Jesus sends him elsewhere. Jesus has a mission for him. And in the same way, as individuals, as a church, as a community of faith, we too are sent to tell the story of what Christ has done for us, to demonstrate how the love and power of Jesus Christ has changed our lives, and to share that, so that everyone might marvel in the places that we go. And there's three things I want to note here in closing that Jesus does. Jesus goes to Gentile territory. The fact that they're raising pigs is evidence that this is a foreign territory from the Jewish circles in which Jesus moved often. And Jesus was taking the disciples. This is right after the calming of the storm. And so Jesus has left the crowds, and he's taking the disciples to a foreign territory. And he goes to the tombs first, where people outcast from society, he doesn't go to the upper crust of society first. He goes to the tombs first. And then finally, Jesus' arrival has an economic impact. And so just touching on these three things briefly. Again, note, Jesus goes to Gentile territory. He leaves behind the community in which he was raised, and he goes to someplace that is different. And it's so important for us to think about that. And maybe this was a little uncomfortable for some of the disciples. What are the places that make you uncomfortable? What are places in Columbus that you don't go to often, maybe that you avoid? Maybe there is a mission for you there. Maybe there is a way for you to go to those communities and be involved and tell the gospel story, live the gospel story, show the gospel story, to be in community, to build relationships with those who are in a different community than you are. And so pay attention to that, to where your usual roots take you, to where your usual relationships are, and think about how Christ is calling you beyond that. And then think about what it means to go to the tombs first. What are the places in society that people avoid? Are there people in society that are forgotten? In all the busyness that is going on, are there people that can almost slip through the cracks? And how can we minister to those people? How are we sent to those communities? I think of community is the children of people struggling with addiction. People who are struggling with addiction, it's so hard to just make it through a day. So how do you care for children? Are there children who are not being adequately or appropriately cared for, caught up in circumstances bigger themselves? How can we as individuals, how can we as a community of faith go to those children and tell the story and live the story and show what gospel love is? And finally, Jesus' arrival in this community has an economic impact. And the people are clearly afraid and unsettled of that, and so they show up and they ask Jesus to leave, which is a really bad look. These pigs have been lost into the sea, and the people are so worried about the economic impact they can't see the miracle of what Jesus has done. They're so focused on what it has cost them in the short term that they push away the one who brings life. And as a result, what is the price they pay in the long term? What have they lost by being so worried about this short-term cost? And so in the same way, wherever Christ calls us, there is an economic impact in our lives. It will cost us something. When Christ calls us, he calls all of us. He calls our time and our energy and our hearts and our wallets too, and it will cost us something. It should cost us something because that's part of us. And so we have to be ready to sacrifice, to pay the cost. And it's a short-term cost. And we get this incredible long-term gain. Christ promises us so much, but so often we can get fixated on what it costs us in terms of money, in terms of inconvenience, all of these costs. And we think it's just easier to avoid the mission, to stay where we're comfortable, to stay where we're known, to stay in the parts of town where we know. But Christ sends us out into the world. And just as this man went forth and told an incredible story about what Christ has done, so too do you have an incredible story about how you, when you were when you were in peril, on the waves, clinging to a piece of debris, wet and afraid, Christ came to you and saved you. Christ came from outside and saved you. There was no other Savior. There is no other Savior. And you have been saved and claimed through the waters of baptism and marked as Christ's own forever. And do not forget that joyous piece of good news. For in him we live. May we tell that story. Thanks be to God.